Hello, welcome to Holistically Speaking. I am Morella DeVoe, your host. My mission with Holistically Speaking is to always bring to you some new tips, some new advice, or new resource that can help you enhance your health, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And sometimes we're connecting the dots in interesting ways between our health and planetary health, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. It's how soil health is connected to human health and why we should all be interested in this. My guest is, I'm all of a sudden thinking about Joel Salatin because we were talking about it, Eric Noel. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So Eric, you're a farmer, right?
That's one of my jobs, yeah.
It's one of your jobs.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I was looking for people to come on the show, you said, oh, I would love to come on the show and talk about soil health. What prompted you to suggest this and say we should be talking about this on the show?
So growing up as on a dairy farm, a conventional dairy farm as a kid, and then going through life noticing the disconnect. We're quite a few generations removed from people growing up on farms. There's only 2% of the population that are farmers.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S. And it might be even less than that now. And then knowing that human health comes from the food that we eat and the soil that it's grown in, trying to make that connection again for people.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think we were having this conversation before that there seems to be a disconnect for a lot of people in just how intimately our personal health is tied to food.
Right.
And what you're bringing to us today is that, well, that connection is also, it goes even one step further, and it's connected to soil health.
Right.
So as a former dairy farmer, because I think what you were telling me is that you've lived in both worlds. You've lived in the world of conventional agriculture, right? So what are some of the mistakes that we're committing as a population when we're growing food in the conventional way?
Right. And this is not to point fingers at farmers or anything, because I am one, but it dates back to the 10,000 years that we've been in agriculture as a global community. It's tilling the soil and leaving it bare and open to the sun. When you till the soil, you're breaking down the biological community and the structure of that soil. And the nutrients that it holds are being volatilized to the sun. And another big thing is the carbon that it holds.
So when you till the soil, it releases carbon into the air? I had no idea.
Yeah, so it's not commonly known, but that there's more carbon being released by tilling the soil than by the cars on the road.
Get out! I have never heard this.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the Midwest, their breadbasket of the world, those soils, before a plow touched them, they were 2 and 3 feet deep with 20% organic matter. And then we started tilling, and then we had the Dust Bowl.
I was just going to ask you about that.
There's sticks out there, measuring sticks out there that show where the soil was, and I mean there's feet of it gone and blew away.
And it's
because they tilled and they took all the plants and the biodiversity and the roots that were holding all that.
Right.
Because, I mean, there's research and they look at how deep plants go, and there's some plants that go 20 feet deep with their roots.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because in Washington, D.C., I was just there a couple weeks ago, and we went to the, oh my gosh,
one of the museums?
The plant museum. What do you call a plant museum? There's a name for that. But anyway, it's part of the Smithsonian.
Right.
And I can't believe, the Botanical Garden.
Exactly.
That's what it is. So the Washington Botanical Garden right now has a beautiful exhibit of roots. And so they grew plants in a certain way where they were able to pull them out. And you see that there's feet and feet and feet of roots, really long. I mean, I tend to think of roots like maybe going this deep, but these plants in grasses, grasses growing roots really, really deep. So what you're saying is the tilling is disturbing that kind of
Well, see, when you're tilling, you're basically shooting for a monoculture crop. You're having one type of plant growing in that soil, which is not what Mother Nature intended. Right. Mother Nature wants biodiversity.
Right.
And it takes time to build all that root structure. So every year, if you're tilling, and then you're burning it up.
Right.
It's not locked up in the soil anymore. So farmers tend to only operate in 6 to 8 inches of soil.
Yeah. So then what are the consequences of the monocrop type of agriculture for the soil?
So when you go to a monoculture, you're taking away biodiversity. And biodiversity, it's a collaboration support system. It's another community, that whole soil.
So it's the biodiversity of the soil, like the organisms?
The organisms and the roots, they all work together. The roots from the plants produce sugars that feed the microbes, that produce the acids that break down the nutrients, that feed back up in the plant, and the plant photosynthesizes, and the cycle continues again.
Yeah.
And every time it does that, every day, it drops off some carbon in the soil too.
It re-feeds the soil.
Right. So the key is to cover the soil, have it covered 100% of the time, and have it 100% covered.
Year-round.
Constant cover. Having roots, living plants growing for as much of the year as possible.
And then what you're saying is in different plants throughout the year.
If you're trying to do a cropping system in a different kind of agriculture, yes, you're choosing different plants and planting at different times and utilizing the different natures of all these biodiverse plants.
So you were raised in a dairy farm in the old model of doing things, but now you're a different kind of farmer. And I asked you, so how did you get into this? And I thought it was a really interesting story. So I want to ask you again, how did you get into this? How do you go from one world to the other world? Because I think you have a pretty compelling story.
So the reason that I left the dairy farming was because I didn't like milking cows. I was a mechanically inclined, gearhead kind of guy, so I went to school for auto mechanics, and then got married, and my wife, straight out of college, had thyroid cancer. We continued to eat conventionally for a couple of years, and then I think it was from the urgings of her mother that we switched to organic, and we started feeling better. So, and at that time we were in Indiana, and I was working on race cars, and we were thinking about starting a family and didn't want to be in the suburban type setting, so we decided to move back to my parents' farm and transition that to an organic, diversified farm. And once we started reading, and we started eating organic, going to those stores and the farmers markets, and we visited the farmers out in Indiana that were doing this kind of agriculture, and we said, well, this is the kind of agriculture we want to do.
Yeah.
So we moved back to Vermont in 2003, and in 2004 we started transitioning the farm to organic. And once we were down that rabbit hole, like I was saying before, there's no going back. Now it's hard for us to go out and eat at a restaurant because you want to know how it's produced, and a lot of times it's getting better, especially in Vermont, but it's hard to figure out exactly. And then when you're in the grocery store, you're reading labels, and a lot of times you put stuff back.
Put it back.
On the
Oh
shelf.
my God, there have been so many times that I pulled something out. Yeah, no, this is saying.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about what your farm looks like these days. Like what animals live there? What plants do you grow?
Right.
So can you paint the picture for us?
Yeah. So the majority of the acreage is in forages and grass. We do grass-fed beef from start to finish. We have the cows, and we just started calving for this year. We do some vegetables, and we have a few laying hens. But our centerpiece is the grass-fed beef.
Yeah.
And so the relationship with the plants and the soil also benefits by the animals. I mean, there's certain, I don't know if it's studies or just people propaganda that's saying that cattle are the bad for the environment.
Right.
Well, they are if you're in a conventional system, because they're concentrated and you're just going the opposite way.
Yeah, people don't realize that in the conventional animal feedlots, in Texas and wherever. You know, they have thousands of cows standing on concrete slab floors, you know, being fed grain in like these troughs. They can't move, they can't go anywhere. And then the massive amount of now, you know, the manure that isn't their natural food is, you know, just kind of flows down into the Mexican Mexican Gulf.
If you have a dry lot and it rains, it's gonna leach out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's funny is that here you are, essentially what would be called a cattle rancher somewhere else in South Hero in Vermont, right? This is the last place you would imagine being a cattle rancher. So tell us a little bit more about that relationship between the health of the soil and why it's so important for all of the animals, including ourselves, that are involved in this ecosystem.
Right. So I mean, if you really think about it and boil it down, the soil is the basis of why we exist on this planet. So knowing that, that's the root cause. And if you treat that soil and build and know that building that to a healthy state, it's going to take care of the plants that are growing in it, the animals that eat it, and if you're growing vegetables for yourself, I mean, the nutrient density is what you're working on, and it's the biology of the soil too. So it's another organism. You got to take care of it. If it was like your pet, because that's what's going to keep you healthy.
Right.
So it's feeding the soil what it needs for nutrients, if it's lacking, because most of the time you're like this farm that we're doing here, we've been there for 2 years. When we got there, it was very depleted in nutrients.
Wow.
So you got to take soil tests and look at that, and you look at the health of the plants. You can go out there. When we first got out there, I mean, the first spring, it started going green and got about 6 inches high. Then it kind of slowed down, started turning yellow, and
oh wow,
we're like, uh-oh. So feeding that system, and it's just knowing that that's the beginning. That's the key. Treat that, and then you get the benefits throughout the whole cycle.
And how do you treat it? How do you rebuild and heal the soil?
Yeah. So there's different strategies. One of them is with the grazing of the cattle. We're not taking the whole plant, because when you take the whole plant, you're taking the reserves out of the soil. You're actually pulling nutrients out, and they're going into the animal, and then when you process the animal, it's leaving the farm.
Yeah.
Or when you hay it, I don't cut right to the ground. I don't leave only 2 inches. I leave 6 inches.
Right. Because earlier you were telling me, and this was so helpful in understanding, that if you cut too low to the ground, then the roots stop growing, and they stop kind of feeding the...
Right. So they'll grow back, but you've knocked it back so far, and it has to go on its reserves to get ramped up. If you leave high residual on the plant, it's a curve. There's a curve model for it, and then it's higher up in the curve, so it recovers quicker, and you get more growth cycles. So you're pumping those nutrients around. So when you take your soil test, you find out what's lacking, and then you add in. Like on our farm here, we were low on a lot of nutrients, but the main ones were phosphorus and potassium. So
how do you add phosphorus and potassium to your
soil? So phosphorus, we found composted poultry litter. There's a big chicken operation in New York, laying operation, and they have organic certified composted poultry litter. We spread some of that on there. And then for the potassium, that comes from wood ash.
Oh.
And the McNeil plant here in Burlington burns wood chips and produces wood ash. So it's a locally sourced wood product that is high in potassium and they have a complex of other micronutrients.
So then once you treat your soil, is this something that you have to do yearly, or does the soil start to recover and then have all of these nutrients naturally?
There is a bank of nutrients locked up in the soil. It's always good to monitor, and keep a maintenance on it. to get to the point of where it just, I don't know that anybody in this country living now has seen a soil that's so good that
right.
it just
Wow.
goes on its own.
You know, this is kind of a revelation for me. It's just kind of learning that our soils are so depleted that we don't really have thriving soils anywhere,
Right.
that we've kind of starved them for centuries probably.
And there's scientists are saying that have studied it, if we continue going with the type of agriculture we have right now for the majority, 60 years of soil left.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I mean, we're already seeing signs of it. We were talking about California.
Yeah. Yeah, the massive drought, and they're still growing. The agriculture refuses to shift,
Right.
it seems.
They till it so much, and it has so low organic matter, it's hard for the water to infiltrate,
Yeah.
and it doesn't hold on to it. As soon as it gets there, it's in the surface and evaporates.
Yeah.
So when they're irrigating that type of agriculture, they're using massive amounts of water over what they should be if they were treating the soil properly.
If the soil was
Because as soon as they're
regenerated.
putting on, most of it's evaporating.
Yeah. And there are
A lot of it's not even getting down into the root zone.
No.
It's on the surface.
Right. This is massive.
It is.
This is massive. So, I'm just so blown away that I'm like, so what do I ask you next? So how have you seen your soil and your crops and your animals change in the couple of years that
Right.
you've been healing the soil?
So, I mean, you can see physical aspects. I mean, the forages, we have legumes coming back, and there's not as yellow as it was. And then we measure the bricks in the leaf tissue, which is a measure of sugar. Energy. So those are creeping up. And then we also weigh our cattle regularly, so we know how much weight they're gaining on a daily basis.
Right.
And when we first started, the first year, it was 1.1 pounds a day gain. In order to do any finishing on beef cattle, you need at least 1.7.
Oh, wow.
Well, we reached that by the end of the first year. The second year, we started out at 1.2. So early spring grass is washy with a lot of water. And then by the end of last year, we're at 2.3.
Wow. And before the show, I mentioned something to you, and I loved your reaction. I said that I've heard many times that in Vermont, you can't finish cattle. You can't finish them on grass.
Right.
And so, what's your response to that?
Yeah, that's a farce. I mean, it can be done. It's just that conventional agriculture, we're not conditioned to think in a certain way that produces that.
Right.
And it's all about, I mean, part of it's about the animal, the genetics you select, but a lot of it is about the management of your soil and how much of the plant that you're giving the cattle. I mean, we move cattle up to 6 times a day.
Wow.
It's training those cows to eat the top portion of the plant where the energy is. And I mean, you've worked on the soil, so it's a nutrient-dense plant. So and then when you're moving them, every time you move them, they get up and eat. If they're laying down, they'll get up and they'll eat. So they're eating more and getting more nutrient density.
Right.
And increasing their daily weight gain. And the more weight they put on per day, the faster it marbles the meat.
So I would imagine that there's a minimum amount of acreage that you need for grazing for a certain number of cows, right? Because if you had too many animals, you would probably run out at some point.
You'd be overstocked and you'd run out of feed.
So how do you find that perfect ratio of?
It all depends on the farm and where it's at with the soil nutrients and the amount of forage you can produce. I mean, we're building up on the farm that we're on. But generally, if you're producing your own feed to feed your cattle through the winter, you need a minimum of 2 acres per animal.
2 acres per animal.
A minimum. If you're just keeping the animals during the grazing season and your soils are doing really well, you can get down to 1 acre per animal. But it's usually around 1.5 acres per animal.
Well, and this I'm just mostly curious, but I'm also thinking about the person who's watching at home and thinking, well, what can I do? Many of the people in Vermont are, you know, they have their own garden,
Right.
you know, maybe raised beds or their garden, you know, in the ground. How many of them are probably thinking that this is the way to do it, right? So, what are some things that people can do to build their own soil and the health of their fruit, of their vegetables?
Look into cover cropping. I mean, like what we do, you can plant, say, oats in the fall or late summer, and that will winter kill. So the oats will die. They'll grow in the fall, and then they'll die off through the winter. And then when you come back to it in the spring, you just plant into. I mean,
into what's there.
You move away the mulch mat that's there, and then you plant into it. Don't till it.
Interesting.
And some people think it's, well, the soil's going to be hard. Well, it may be for the first year or whatever. It's not going to be as friable or loosened up as it should be. But if you continue the process, it's actually going to be better than if you tilled it.
Right.
Because when you till it, whatever depth you're tilling to, it creates a hard pan.
Oh, wow.
And the roots are only going to go to that point. Because roots can only grow through soil that's loose enough for the roots to
and then you'll have
penetrate.
Water runoff probably.
Right, the soil's only going to hold so much, and it'll saturate quicker. But looking at cover crops, sequences.
Yeah. So oats is one, and
oats, winter rye. I mean, there's for legumes. If you want to add pull nitrogen from the atmosphere, legumes naturally pull into their plant system nitrogen and deposit it in the soil in nodules. So legumes like peas and vetch and I can't think of another one right now.
That's okay. You know, it's interesting, and I don't want to go on a tangent with this, but I was just in California a couple weeks ago, and one of the most interesting conversations I had with anybody there was about foraging, wild foraging, and this was in the middle of Berkeley. So we went on a walk around a few blocks in Berkeley, foraging for wild edibles from the sidewalk. You know, it was pretty interesting, and it mostly obviously were weeds. And one of the things that he was saying is, you know, these plants are so hardy and they volunteer everywhere, and you could throw them. And so he was saying that these weeds, things like, oh my God, plantain was one, and I'm blanking. Nasturtium was another one that we pulled. I don't know, but he was pointing out these different plants, and he said they could be used as cover crops. Is this something that you've heard? You know, can you say, oh, I'm gonna. Oh, that's your phone.
I shouldn't be doing that.
But is this something that you've looked into? Is this feasible, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's we have to look at plants in a different way. I mean, what most conventional farmers call weeds, a lot of them, my cows eat them. Yeah. Because if you look at the nutrient complex on some of these weeds, they're actually better than the forages you're growing.
Right.
There's more nutrient density to them.
Yeah.
And then they're pulling different nutrients from different places in the soil. And that all goes back to the symbiotic relationship of those biodiverse plants.
Right.
And it's a lot easier because they're genetically dispositioned to grow where they're growing, because that's where they're growing and you didn't put them there.
Right. So keep the dandelions.
Yeah, dandelions are a tonic, liver tonic, and they're high in energy. My cows eat them. That's great. And one way to know that if you're a beef eater, to know that it's a nutrient dense, it's just the flavor. We have people ask us all the time what we season our beef with. Yeah. And it's nothing. It's just a flavor. Yeah. It's similar to the different, what do they call it, terroir of the.
He's insisting on reaching you.
Of the soil for winemakers.
Yeah.
Same thing with beef. The flavor comes through from the soil.
Wow. So I want to be sure, before we run out of time, to show viewers how to find more information about your farm and the fabulous products that you have coming from there. So your website farm is healthheroislandfarm.com. So for people watching at home, healthheroislandfarm.com. And this is information in general about your farm, and you have a CSA, right?
Right, we have a multi-farm CSA. We work with other farmers. And yeah, that's the overall farm website.
And everybody's organic on the CSA, or for the most part?
Most people are. If they aren't, it's disclosed.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the other website is grassfedbeefvt.com. And what sort of information are people going to find on this website?
So the grass-fed beef is specific to our beef operation,
Mm-hmm.
and it's everything about purchasing beef, and it's the most nutrient dense and most flavorful beef I've ever tasted. I can't seem to find any other beef that touches it.
And grass finished, which isn't a lot of times you find grass fed but not grass finished.
Right.
And then the third website that you were sharing there,
Mm-hmm.
it's nrcs.usda. So this is a really long domain, but essentially what you're pointing at is people who visit this website it would be looking for what they find on the website.
NRCS is a Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's part of USDA,
Mm-hmm.
and they're big on soil health,
Yeah.
and they have a whole soil health campaign, and that's the specifics page for soil health. So if you want to learn specifics on how to produce soil health, that's a good resource right there. And we are under some NRCS programs for things that we're doing on the farm here.
How common is the concern amongst farmers in Vermont? Do you see a lot of people getting into this kind of soil conservation and soil rebuilding?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of farmers getting on the bandwagon.
Mm-hmm.
When they're actually, it's a big paradigm shift, because it takes a different way of thinking about the soil and how they're operating, and it takes a lot of times a different set of equipment, and it's hard for people to change out of their routine. So it's a shift that needs to happen, but it is happening. I see the younger generation. So if you have, I think the average age of farmers is in the late 50s.
Oh, wow.
And their younger generation, if they're staying on the farm, are picking up on the technology and the new equipment and the new way of doing things, and looking more into the soil health.
Right. And so they're starting to do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
So it's encouraging to hear that farmers are really taking action.
Right.
And I think what I'm taking away, and what I would love viewers to take away, is that we can each contribute to this by the food choices that we make, and that they're going to be food choices that are going to support our health more directly, because we're going to be eating foods from nutrient-dense soils.
Right.
And we're going to be helping to support the people who are taking action to rebuild the soil. I think that it behooves us all to be mindful of where we're buying our vegetables from, and if we're buying them from depleted soils in California and that sort of thing. So it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you. Certainly eye-opening, and I'm sure that it's eye-opening for a lot of people who might have never thought that soil health was so important, and how in which grave peril it is right now. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for joining us. See you next time.